Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Now today I'm doing something slightly different and I'm going to do a book review of this new book by Dr Callum Watson, published recently by Pen and Sword, who specialise in historical textbooks, usually on the medieval era. And as the title suggests, this is a new study of the famous Battle of Bannockburn, in which King Robert I, Robert the Bruce, defeated the English, led by Edward II. As I'm sure many of you will know, Bannockburn being one of the most famous battles ever fought within the British Isles. And I've written a lengthy review of the book, which I will be publishing on my various social media sites, Facebook, Substack, etc. But I thought I would do a video review as well, just for good measure. And I've printed out my notes, so as always, forgive me as I glance down at my notes as this review goes along, because there's quite a lot to talk about here. This is quite a packed book. It's an in-depth study, but it's not a dry textbook as such. It's very much for a popular market, a wider readership. Although Callum Watson holds a doctorate and he works at the Bannockburn Centre in Scotland, this is not a dry academic study as such. It's very well footnoted, very well sourced. It's got an extensive bibliography at the back, but it's written in a very sort of readable and engaging style. So it should appeal to anyone with an interest in the subject, really. So I'll just read a few sort of highlights of this review I've written. So one of the most impressive features of this book is the meticulous build-up in which Callum draws heavily upon contemporary sources, written, printed sources, to explain the policy of Robert the Bruce and his rival Edward II on the eve of the Bannockburn campaign. Now, although the records are incomplete, it seems Bruce was actually unwell in the months leading up to the battle. He had fallen sick, and Callum explains how Bruce suffered from quite a mysterious recurrent illness throughout his life, which would eventually kill him. It was said to be leprosy at the time, but probably wasn't, because Bruce led a very active life and was able to recover from these bouts of illness. Now, obviously, you wouldn't recover from something like leprosy. But whatever it was, it kept him out of action until the battle itself, when he returned to take command of the Scots. In the meantime, the Scots were led by his brother Edward Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and later High King of Ireland for a short time, who I did a video on earlier. Bruce, or King Robert as I shall refer to him, he may have also passed a sentence of forfeiture on all those Scots who refused to come to his allegiance, who continued to defy the Bruce kingship, although the exact timing of this is uncertain. As for Edward II, his position is easier to define. There's quite clear evidence of his growing concern at matters in Scotland, where his sort of fragile regime, the English regime bequeathed by his father, Edward I, Longshanks, was already sort of falling to pieces, or it had been for several years, really. There's quite clear evidence that Edward intended to lead a military expedition against the Scots, and to demonstrate this, Callum looks beyond the British Isles, and he highlights some correspondence in October 1313, when Edward II sent letters to the Roman Emperor, or the Byzantine Emperor in the East, Andronicus II, requesting the release of Sir Giles Argentan, who was in prison at Salonika. Giles was one of the most famous knights of the time and would famously act as Edward's bodyguard at the Battle of Bannockburn. So the king's desire to secure his release implies that Edward specifically intended for Giles to serve in Scotland. Furthermore, Edward was alarmed by complaints brought by his Scottish allies, because the Plantagenet regime did have allies among the Scots at this stage, principally Sir Adam Gurdon and Patrick Dunbar, the Earl of March. These throw light on the chaos in Scotland prior to Bannockburn, where the English position was, as I said, falling to pieces. Edward's Scottish allies were not only being attacked by the Bruce Scots, but the English garrisons at Berwick and Roxburgh near the border. And one of these English officers was in fact a Scot, Thomas Pencaitland, the son of a man who had defected to Edward I back in 1298. And these pleas give a glimpse, a real insight into the shifting allegiances in Scotland, in which this endless war situation had thrown everything into flux, and so everybody was preying on everyone else. It was Edward II's task to try and restore order, a pretty thankless task really, which he promised to do by, quote, advancing against our enemies and rebels in those parts. And it seems that Bruce, for the moment, simply meant to stay out of Edward's way, wait for the English king to run out of patience and money, as he had done before, back in 1310, and then resume terrorising English garrisons once Edward was forced to withdraw. This kind of guerrilla warfare strategy had served Bruce pretty well on previous English campaigns in Scotland, and there was no obvious reason to abandon it and risk a pitched battle. To quote one chronicle, the Vita Edwardi Secundii, the life of Edward II, but always as the English army approached, he, Robert the Bruce, King Robert, kept to the trackless, boggy mountain places into which such an army could not easily penetrate. Edward was also driven by his problems at home in England, where he faced serious challenges from the Ordainers, a group of nobles and churchmen who wished to force him to reform the abuses of his government. And Callum argues that the Bannockburn campaign was as much an excuse for Edward to get away from his domestic opponents, the Ordainers in England, as well as to improve his own political capital, his status and standing as the King of England by winning a great victory against the Scots, which of course he failed to do catastrophically. Callum then provides a detailed account of the preparations for the campaign on both sides. As usual, more detail survives for the English side due to the existence of so many administrative accounts, which were being generated by the English state by this stage, the late 13th century, early 14th century. These include details of victualling, supply, wage accounts, and other financial arrangements which were generated by the Exchequer at Westminster. We have far less information for the Scottish side, so Callum has to speculate as to the size of the army Bruce could field at Bannockburn. It seems anything between about 4,000 to maybe 10, 15,000, probably somewhere in between. Now, the focus on administration may sound a bit dry, but does make for a really interesting contrast between the two kingdoms. England at this stage was a quite powerful centralised state with a sophisticated bureaucracy set up to handle finance, military matters. The Scottish government, by contrast, was far more decentralised. It tended to move around, which meant there was no fixed bureaucracy in any one place. This was a big advantage for the Scots in one way, since it meant there was no one city or region that the English could seek to conquer, which would enable them to take control of the heart of the Scottish administration, because there wasn't one. It just kept moving around. The main focus of the book, however, is the military aspect, as you would expect, because the focus is the Battle of Bannockburn. Callum describes how the Scots, led by the Bruces, operated a deliberate scorched earth policy, guerrilla warfare, and from about 1312 launched repeated raids into northern England. These were meant to show that Edward II could not defend his kingdom, the northern counties, and to exploit the political turmoil in England. Much of this revolved around Edward's favourite, the famous Piers Gaveston, his alleged male lover, who was deeply unpopular at the English court. The Scottish raids were brutal, although Callum does make the point that Bruce's men tended to kill only those who resisted them. Now, whether this was particularly merciful or a sort of calculated pragmatic strategy is a moot point, because if the Scots had simply killed everybody, there would be nobody left to pay further blackmail when the Scots came back. So it made sense to leave people alive, because then you could milk them again when you launched more attacks into northern England. And this sort of wasting or guerrilla strategy, which is very typical of medieval warfare, wasn't confined to Scotland, was done very, very skillfully and effectively by the Scots. Previous Scottish raids under the likes of William Wallace had been quite chaotic affairs, but Bruce's raids were systematic, organised and highly disciplined. And apart from spreading terror among the English, they were calculated to extort payments to support Bruce's war effort. And these were in the shape of what Callum calls the 3 C's: cattle, cash and corn. Discipline was also important for the purpose of blackmail, since the English would not pay over these large sums, these blackmail payments, if they thought they were going to be robbed anyway. And then we turn to the battle itself, and here Callum very closely examines Bruce's, King Robert's preparations in the weeks before the event, and his use of the landscape of the countryside to win the victory for the Scots. He examines each episode of the battle in turn, because it was fought over a couple of days, beginning with the skirmish at the New Park, where the English leadership, which was already divided, arguing amongst itself, triggered a really disastrous cavalry charge into a series of specially dug pits. Again, to quote the text, "a contrivance full of evils, holes with stakes, so that they may not pass without disasters." So basically the English cavalry charged straight into these specially dug hidden pits. This very unpromising start was followed by the famous duel between King Robert and Sir Henry Bohun, an English knight. Now Callum's very familiar with the sources, and he's very even-handed in the way he presents them. And he points out that the earliest version of this duel actually paints Bruce in quite an unheroic light. It describes the Scottish king killing Bohun when the Englishman tried to escape a Scottish ambush. He had allegedly actually been attacked by a large number of Scotsmen, and as he was trying to get away, King Robert basically came up behind him and cracked him on the head, which is very different from this sort of chivalric duel, which is how it's painted by John Barber, a Scottish chronicler poet writing many years later in the mid-14th century. And he was the one who wrote the popular tale in which Bohun surprised King Robert while the latter was inspecting his troops, charged him with his lance, and then Bruce turned around, hit him with his axe and killed him stone dead, and then supposedly rode back to his cheering troops and said, "Oh, I have broken my good axe." Callum also highlights another version, yet another one, written by Sir Thomas Gray about the same time as John Barber, shortly beforehand. And this says it wasn't Henry Bohun at all who Bruce killed, but an English knight called Piers Mountforth. So we don't really know what happened here. And the most Callum will say is that the existence of 3 independent accounts suggests there may be some truth to the tale, but whatever it was, we don't really know. So the fight at the New Park was followed by another skirmish in which the English knights failed to learn their lesson from the initial fight and were once again defeated by the Scottish spearmen on foot. So this was a very bad start for the English, and it got worse when Edward II attempted to move his army onto the Carse of Stirling, beyond the tidal streams, which were called Powes by the Scots. And this was the only firm land where his army could camp. So he was already, before the fighting started, or before the real fighting started, he'd already been outmanoeuvred by King Robert, who was forcing Edward to take the best of a pretty limited set of options. And then we come to the climactic day of the battle itself, Monday 24th of June 1314. After hearing mass, the Scots deployed in rectangular blocks of foot soldiers with their long spears pointed in the direction of the enemy. And to the great shock and dismay of the English, these Scottish spear formations started to move forward. 2 of the Scottish divisions started to move and advance towards the English, when previously they'd always remained rooted to the spot, like the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, 16 years earlier, where William Wallace was defeated because his spearmen couldn't move. All they could do was sit there and present a very vulnerable target to English archers. Bannockburn, it was different. The Bruces had trained their spearmen to move forward, which the English didn't expect. So this meant that Edward's army, which was much larger, probably 2 or 3 times the size of the Scottish army, if not more, was suddenly trapped between 2 streams, the Bannockburn and the Pell stream, squeezed into this increasingly cramped space where the waters flowed together. Their only way out was to try and muscle their way through the dense formations of Scottish spears, but their knights, their cavalry, couldn't break through these very tightly disciplined blocks of Scottish infantry. Their archers briefly threatened to turn the tide by shooting down the Scots, again as they had done at Falkirk 16 years earlier. But then they were scattered by a charge of Scottish cavalry. So the English, the famous English and Welsh archers, the longbowmen, were out of it. They'd been knocked out. The death of the Earl of Gloucester, young Gilbert de Clare, Edward II's cousin, probably killed during these initial charges, was another blow to English morale, which was already pretty fragile. And then at the crucial moment when King Robert judged the English army to be at breaking point, he threw in his reserve of hardened troops from Carrick, the Western Highlands and the Hebrides. According to John Barber, these men were joined by the rabble of the Scottish camp, spreading panic among the English, who were already very hard pressed. And it's at this point that the English army, squeezed into this tight space, unable to break out of this very carefully calculated trap that the Scots had set up, it broke, fled in all directions, and was quickly reduced to this big mob of fugitives, of terrified men trying to get out, get across the stream, even climb the slopes of Stirling Castle, do anything to get away. Edward II himself was almost captured, and he owed his escape to Giles de Argentan, who I mentioned earlier, who dragged the king from the field before turning round, deliberately riding back onto the battlefield to throw himself onto the Scottish spears and basically commit a form of sort of chivalrous suicide, because, as he said, I've never fled from a battle yet, and I'm not going to do it now. So he went and got himself killed. Some of the fleeing English, as I said, tried to scale the heights of Castle Hill. Many were drowned, or followed Edward south, abandoning the baggage and the entire royal treasury. Many were trampled, drowned in the mud and water, although most of the nobles got away, accompanied by some very bedraggled, naked, in some cases, Welsh infantry. One of the captured English knights had the fantastic name of Sir Marmaduke Thweng. He had previously fought at Falkirk and Stirling Bridge, and his shield consisted of 3 green popinjays, so he was quite a colourful figure. He and another English prisoner, Sir Ralph Monthermer, were treated courteously by Bruce, who treated his captives quite well, ransomed them. And this reconstruction of the battle is then followed by an equally skillful, nuanced analysis of the aftermath. The desperation of Edward II's position is shown by the loss of his Privy Seal, left behind in the rout. The Privy Seal was the ultimate symbol of kingship. It was used to formally sign off on any kind of royal correspondence. So without it, Edward couldn't govern, basically. And humiliatingly, he had to borrow his wife's Privy Seal, Queen Isabella of France. And then, as an extra sort of sting in the tail, King Robert returned Edward's seal, both as a way of emphasising the parity between the two kingdoms. He was saying, I'm returning your seal to you because we are fellow monarchs. I'm not just an outlaw, I am the King of Scots, and by returning your seal to you, that is my way of saying that we are on the equal terms now. It was also a very humiliating reminder of Edward's recent defeat. The English king was also obliged to deal with a very messy and expensive business of ransoming prisoners taken by the Scots, and this included Scots who had actually fought on the English side at Bannockburn. Men who were opposed to Bruce, refused to accept his kingship, regarded him as a usurper, and would go on to resist Bruce and his heir, King David, his son, for many years to come, and be a thorn in the side to the Bruce monarchy in Scotland. So this wasn't simply an English v Scottish conflict. It was more sort of nuanced than that, as most medieval wars tended to be. Callum also emphasises that Bannockburn was not decisive. Edward II would recover and lead an even bigger army into Scotland in 1319. As usual, to no great effect, he failed again. He never achieved anything in Scotland. Meanwhile, the Scots pressed their military advantage, mounting ever bigger and more destructive raids into the northern counties of England, which were now completely exposed to Scottish raids, more or less. Edward was unable to mount any kind of effective response, and eventually the northern communities, realising that their king couldn't protect them, they switched to making private deals and truces with the Scots, and even recognising Bruce's title as Regis Scotiae, King of Scots. And these sort of endless disasters, shameful defeats, coupled with Edward's increasingly tyrannical regime in England, eventually led to his deposition and probable murder by his wife Isabella of France and her ally Roger Mortimer. Within Scotland, despite his victory at Bannockburn, King Robert's position was still not secure. In 1320, 6 years after the battle, despite repeatedly defeating the English, he was faced with the Sewell's conspiracy, organised by his domestic enemies, principally the Balliol and Comyn factions. This was followed by a round of ruthless executions and forfeitures in which King Robert either killed or drove out his political opponents. He was pretty ruthless, Robert, ruthless as anyone. Which provided him with more lands to distribute to his loyal followers in Scotland, so he could strengthen his power base. As I said before, though, plenty of Scottish nobles were still unwilling to accept Bruce as king, and these would go on to form the nucleus of a body of men called the Disinherited, who would play a key role in triggering the Second War of Scottish Independence a few years later, after King Robert's death. And that almost witnessed the collapse of his regime, only 15 to 20 years after Bannockburn. So the Bruce position in Scotland, despite King Robert's all of his achievements and victories, it was still very unstable for many years to come. And it's worth repeating that Bannockburn, although it was a great victory for the Scots and a terrible defeat for the English, it really settled nothing. It was not decisive. Very few of these battles were in the medieval period. So overall then, to sum up, this is a highly readable and precise account of a very famous battle, written with verve, energy and a clear passion for the subject. Callum Watson mixes his scholarship with a very clear and precise writing style and conveys a deep knowledge and understanding of the subject and the sources without bogging any of it down in fine detail. I don't think anyone will be put off by his style. This is not a dry read by any standard. And so anybody with an interest in this era of Scottish history, British history, and the rise of the Bruce dynasty from pretty much nowhere really, would do very well to start here. So there we go. Here is the book again. There it is. I'll provide a link in the description. And if you like that video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.